When Monkey D. Sun God defeated Doflamingo on Dressrosa, the final attack he had to face was the very curiously named 16 Holy Bullets, and it consisted of Doflamingo firing off exactly 16 strings at Luffy, who went all Neo in the Matrix, stopping them with a single hand, and then smacked Doflamingo to the cold ground below. When I was reading this weekly at the time, I remember vividly thinking that this was a bit of an underwhelming final attack from Mr. Sir Flamingo. Usually the last thing we see from a major antagonist villain man is their big old ultimate super attack of doom, but these 16 string things felt more like an opening attack than it did a big finisher. And it would take 170 chapters and 7 years of real-world publishing time for us, or maybe just for me, as readers, to understand the true significance of Doflamingo's attack. As in chapter 1060, the Lucia Kingdom was bombarded by the ancient weapon Uranus, which consisted of exactly 16 pillars of purging light. 16 holy bullets, if you will. Bullets that were decreed from above and shot in the exact same way that Doflamingo's strings were. So we need to answer 3 questions. Firstly, what is the significance of the number 16? Has it appeared elsewhere in the series? And mate, let me tell you, this turned out to be a far deeper rabbit hole than I was initially prepared for. But secondly, why was Doflamingo replicating the attack of an ancient weapon, and how aware of Uranus is he? The answer to that one's going to make you feel a bit uncomfortable, because he is very aware of it. And finally, how much does Doflamingo know about Emu, and how was he planning to use Emu to attain his goal of something world domination? Lots to do, and I generally try not to dive too deeply into ideas that only have 1 or 2 points of evidence, because 2 is just a coincidence, especially in a series as long and as large as One Piece, but 3 is a pattern, and anything more than 3 is excessively beating you over the head to get your attention. So we have our 16 holy bullets of Doflamingo, the 16 shots of Uranus, but we also have Luffy ringing the ox bell at Marineford 16 times according to world government tradition, and even a civilian in chapter 763 stated that a world noble shot his sons a total of 16 times for the crime of walking across their path, which took place in Doflamingo's flashback, by the way. So that's already 4, and this next one, it's a bit of a stretch, but I thought I'd include it anyway for reasons that will shortly become clear. But when Mr. St. Charlos enters the human auction house on Sabri, he very conveniently does so with the announcement of entry number 16. You might think I'm crazy for bringing that one up, but mate, I am about to take you on a journey of belief, because even without that, there is a confirmed connection and meaning behind the number 16 in world noble culture. And whenever numbers become significant in One Piece, the first place to look for meaning is usually in Buddhism. Zoro tends to be a great example of this. Whenever he mentions a number like a 108-pound phoenix or 3,000 worlds, those numbers generally hold great meaning in Buddhist spirituality and cosmology. And Buddhism, I should say, is directly connected to Emu. Emu's name is written in the katakana E and Mu, which I will say can also be read as 1 and 6 thanks to Gorowase, very much in keeping with the 16 theming. But when the symbols of Emu's name are put together, they actually form this one very curious kanji, which has 2 meanings. The first and most recognized reading is Hotoke, meaning Buddha, so it makes sense to look to Buddhism initially to find the answer here. And one very curious concept is known as the 16 mental defilements, which are conditions of the mind that require purification, although I guess in the case of world nobles, these are the 16 principles by which they lead their lives, which include greed, malice, contempt, jealousy, hypocrisy, vanity, haughtiness, and a lot of other not so great things that come together to form 16. It really is quite interesting to look at the full list of these mental defilements and see that putting all of those together ends up crafting the perfect world noble. But 16 actually has a much greater significance. Remembering that the kanji that Emu's name constructs has 2 meanings, and now just stick with me here and remember that I, man on the internet, did not invent Japanese, and I don't know why what I'm about to say is a thing, but this kanji, which can be read as Buddha, can also be read as France, where 16 is a very significant number, with Louis XVI being the last king of France prior to the French Revolution, which is very much in keeping with Emu, as he is assumedly going to be the last king of the world government before the global One Piece world revolution. As a point of semantic order, I know that Louis XVI wasn't the last king. That's why I said the last one before the revolution. But there comes a certain point where I don't know how much of this is intentional and how much is coincidence. I just know that the how much is a lot. And I also know that Oda tends to pay very, very careful attention to puns. So I can see him taking this kanji and creating a character that inhabits both of its meanings. A wise, twisted Buddha-esque risk being that also involves something France. I actually shouldn't be so flippant about the French connection because there's quite a bit more to this. To go back to Louis XVI, one of the reasons why he was overthrown and executed was due to the starvation of his people, which occurred primarily due to a very severe winter, which decimated their food reserves. And that's very similar to the world nobles of Marie-Joie currently experiencing a famine thanks to the Revolutionary Army, the leader of which is something of a weather phenomenon himself. And in addition to that, Louis decided that one of the main solutions to this starvation problem would be to heavily increase taxes on the poorest people, in much the same way that the world government demands a heavenly tribute from all of its affiliated nations. And crazily enough, that didn't work out too well for Louis. And I have talked about world nobles being based specifically on French monarchs in other videos before, which I think holds up because Penguer Castle itself is modeled after Chateau de Chambord, which was built as a, what passed for the French definition of modest, hunting lodge, with hunting being a pretty large aspect of world noble culture, or at least it was up until the God Valley incident. And in chapter 1086, we had the introduction of Mr. St. Figel Garling, but whilst this was going on, the world nobles were complaining in the background about their food options, saying, "We have no food, no bread, only cake to eat," which is almost certainly a reference to Marie Antoinette's Let Them Eat Cake, with Marie Antoinette, of course, being the wife of King Louis XVI. So look, I'm usually pretty skeptical about this number stuff, but I genuinely think that there's something here. I feel that Oda is trying to portray Marie-Joie as the final days before the French Revolution, or at least heavily using it as inspiration. And if he keeps going in this direction, what we'll need is some sort of a Napoleon to rise up, and if that were to happen, my eyes would be looking in the general direction of Figel and Garling. But that is an idea for another time. For now, I think that the number 16 is a combination of meaning. Spawned from Imu's name, which can be read as 1 and 6, but also Buddha and France, and so a world noble firing a 16 bullet attack and really holding this number 16 to great esteem means embracing the 16 mental defilements that characterize them, as well as represents the proliferation of a society on the brink of revolution. It could also be other things that we aren't yet aware of, such as perhaps Imu being the 16th king out of the 20 to form the original World Government Alliance. It could even be a reference to Imperial Japan, as their rising sun flag had 16 red rays of sun emerging from it, and it is seen as a symbol of war, which ties into the theorized depiction of Pluton on the moon during NL's cover story, as that sun had 16 points, and even the ancient weapon Poseidon, which was properly awakened by Shirahoshi when she was 16 years old. And to add to all of that, Uranus was first used in chapter 1060, and if you take away those pesky zeros, there is that nasty number 16 again. Lots of 16, lots of weapons, and lots of war, and so the meaning of the number 16 could just be all of the above. 16 is a bad number. And in fact, what I've really learned from making this video is that the number 16 is the only one in all of existence that could describe a world noble culture so well. So when stuff happens like Charlos entering the auction house with the announcement of number 16, it really would not surprise me if that was extremely intentional and almost like the announcer of fate heralding the arrival of a world noble. And when it comes to Uranus specifically, we have a very curious case, because the ancient weapons, at least as far as we know, were not created by the world government. We know for a fact that Pluton wasn't, that was built on Water 7, and Poseidon is more of an inherited ability, but Uranus was powered by the Mother Flame, which was not a technology that the world government had access to. And given that fact, it feels more likely that Imu elected to have it fire exactly 16 times as part of their symbology. The weapon itself is probably capable of firing more or less than that. In fact, I would say that 16 shots is probably overkill, like shooting 16 bullets into that dude's kid. It can be seen as complete and unambiguous eradication. And one question that we've had to grapple with ever since the introduction of Imu is, do the world nobles themselves know about him? Do they know that when they put the number 16 on a pedestal, they've literally placed some dude with the number 16 on a big chair? And I'd have to say the answer to that is almost certainly not, because that would mean recognizing a god above themselves, and I just don't think they're mentally capable of it. And I think that if they did, Imu would have become common knowledge since long before now, if only due to the more moral world nobles like Saint Homing and Saint Mosgard, who could have spread the word. But they had no idea. However, Doflamingo is a different case entirely. If you were to ask the world's greatest gateway to knowledge, Google, if Doflamingo knows about Imu, then it answers the following: yes, the character of Doflamingo in One Piece knows about Imu, the leader of the world government. Doflamingo was even revealed to have been interacting with Imu directly. And I do feel it's very important that right below that, it has the disclaimer that AI responses may include mistakes. Good disclaimer, because that's a pretty pretty big mistake there. Doflamingo has never been shown interacting directly with Emu. However, it is heavily hinted that Doflamingo has seen Emu before, or at the very least knows about Emu. In chapter 906, we get to visit Doflamingo in Impel Down, who's having a surprisingly good time despite his conditions, and he spends a few panels musing about his incoming assassination. Why the solitary cell, huh? A guy could get lonely down here. Or is this meant to protect me, Magellan? Have they come for me, an assassin from above, to make sure that I don't go spilling the secrets of Marijoi's hidden treasure? A hired killer to silence me for good, eh? He. Just let the secret out. Power has such a short shelf life. It goes bad very quickly. And it's after this monologue that we cut to Marijois and we see Emu for the very first time, carrying Luffy's bounty and opening a very frosty vault containing the enigma that is the giant straw hat, which could imply by juxtaposition that Doflamingo was talking about Emu as the treasure. But this is not the first time that Doflamingo spoke about this hidden treasure. And very importantly, he always seems to have a different adjective to describe it. Here, it was a hidden treasure, but previously he's also called it a crucial treasure and a national treasure. And the assumption has mostly been that Doflamingo was referring to an object, with the two leading ideas on that being either the massive straw hat or the ancient weapon Uranus itself. However, as stated before, I believe that Doflamingo may have been referring to Emu, and it's because he describes this treasure as follows. It's because I know about a crucial treasure that exists within sacred Marijois, and the very fact of its existence would shake the world to its foundations. And that's not something I believe that the giant straw hat could currently do, unless, say, it has a massive amount of Joy Boy hockey infused into it and basically acts as a giant global hockey bomb. But other than that, should it be revealed, not enough people really understand the significance of a straw hat for it to deal any damage. Not even we as readers truly understand what this hat means at this stage. And it really doesn't fit with the second part of Doflamingo's statement, which was about obtaining Trafalgar Law's devil fruit. At a currently unknown point in time, Doflamingo returned to the Holy Land of Marijois, which is where he discovered this treasure, and he was relentlessly hunted down as a result, but Doflamingo was able to slither his way out like a well-lubed otter, and he stated, "If only I'd had the power of the op-op fruit in my grasp on that specific day years ago, I would have been able to make use of that Marijois treasure to seize the world." That is how valuable and useful those powers are, not only for the personality switching surgery, but one ability even greater. So the straw hat doesn't really fit that criteria. If Doflamingo has Law's devil fruit powers, then I don't know, the hat, I guess it's stylish. And Doflamingo is a man known for making bold fashion choices. But I would say that the ancient weapon Uranus doesn't fit what he was talking about either. Even if Doflamingo managed to discover that the world government was in possession of Uranus, he has no way to power it without the Mother Flame, and having Trafalgar Law's devil fruit doesn't change that in any way. Although things do get slightly more complicated here because Doflamingo is implied to have some understanding of Uranus as well, not just because of his tribute attack that looks exactly how Uranus functions, but because after the rise of global sea levels, Doflamingo says to Magellan that most cities in this world would be wiped out with an extra 5 meters of water, and he then suggests that they should move to higher ground, almost as if he knew exactly what caused this rise in sea level. It wasn't a natural phenomena, and it was probably going to happen at least 5 more times. 5 meters is just 5 more shots. Somehow Doflamingo, he knows this, or he has a sense of this. But look, even if he did want Uranus, even if that was the main goal, there is a much easier way to get it, because Trafalgar Law's devil fruit would have given Doflamingo instant dominion over the entire planet if he'd been able to switch personalities with Emu. After that point, Uranus would have come under his domain by default, as well as the suspected immortality possessed by Emu's body. And having seen Emu is probably why Doflamingo is so confident that this surgery even works to begin with, because he has seen at least one example of an immortal being. And there's no doubt that Doflamingo seeks to sit on the empty throne, or at least create a new world with him in the equivalent position after purging the otherworld nobles, because in chapter 782 we are given this panel of Doflamingo and his 4 executive officers bowing towards him, with Doflamingo standing atop a pile of rubble. And if you think this panel looks familiar, it's not just because you read it and you've seen it once, it's because Oda deliberately reused this composition for another much more iconic panel later on, which was chapter 908, where the 5 elders are bowing to Emu in the same position, replicated right down to the smallest, teeny tiniest of details, such as having 2 speech bubbles flanking Emu filled with dedicated words to serve as his wings, and even very minor things like the walking stick of Saint Saturn and the sword of Ethan Barrow Baron Venus duo being in the same position as Treble Staff and Diamante Sword in the original panel. What's happening here is not a coincidence. Oda drew Doflamingo and Emu very intentionally to parallel one another, and it's only in retrospect that we really understand how horrifyingly high Doflamingo's ambition was. If there was ever a point in history where Emu was a human rather than a dark silhouette creature, I could very much imagine him having an extremely similar personality and drive to Doflamingo. But there is also a common misconception with Doflamingo's motives that he was referring to the perpetual youth surgery and effective immortality as the mechanism to use in combination with the national treasure that would have allowed him to seize the world. However, Doflamingo never actually clarifies which aspect of Lord's Devil Fruit he had in mind for that specific day, and he does mention both the perpetual youth surgery and the personality switching, so it could be either. And the reason why this gets slightly confusing is because this is Doflamingo's hypothetical. If he had that power on that day, then this, but that's not necessarily his plan that he's working towards on Dressrosa. After discovering that Law had eaten the Op-Op fruit, Doflamingo stated that he'd need to make sure to raise Law to die for his sake, which implies performing the surgery, but not necessarily because all of the Don Quixote family are branded with this mentality, and in fact Doflamingo even made this exact request to both Virgo and Monet on Punk Hazard. He asked them to die for his sake. So it's frustratingly unclear, but look, the Occam's razor here, the simplest answer is that Doflamingo did want to use Law to attain the perpetual youth surgery, but also he's a complicated guy and his exact plan is never revealed. It's just something world domination. And I think the reason for that vagueness is because this plan involves Emu, a being that Doflamingo almost certainly knows about, and one that would be very problematic to overcome even if Doflamingo was to attain perpetual youth. Not aging is one thing, but the surgery of the Op-Op fruit would not grant Doflamingo the regenerative abilities that the Abyss does. So the easiest thing from my perspective would be to have a trusty subordinate consume the Op-Op fruit and use it to switch Doflamingo and Emu's bodies. And in that case, it would be entirely possible that the 5 elders, even if they knew about this, would be forced to serve Emu Flamingo because his abilities can kill them with a single snap of a silhouetted finger. And should Doflamingo ever be released from Impel Down, there is every chance that he would resume this nefarious plan.